The morning of December 26, 2014, started for the employees of the DoubleTree Hotel in Portland, Oregon, just like any other day. In the midst of the holiday season, at a conveniently located hotel across from a large shopping center, it was hard to find an available room. Guests were coming and going. It was during this time that someone from the staff found the body of a young woman on the staircase. She was dressed inappropriately for the season, had no identification on her, and at first glance, it seemed like she might have accidentally fallen down the stairs, but only at first glance. When detectives began piecing together the fragments of this unusual case, they made a series of unsettling discoveries. They would have to contend with three potential suspects, a mysterious double-faced guest, and a victim with a dark secret. 24-year-old Ashley Benson always seemed like a very happy person. Until the age of 13, she lived in Montana with her mother and then moved to the suburbs of Portland, Oregon to live with her father, Michael, and stepmother, Jody. She had wonderful relationships with her father, and soon, she genuinely grew to love her stepmother. The move was a significant change in the girl's life, but it turned out to be beneficial for her. In Portland, she blossomed. She spent a lot of time with her family, loved outdoor activities, and made many friends at school. Friends adored her for her easygoing nature, infectious laughter, and kindness. One of her friends recalls that Ashley was one of those people who would give you the shirt off her back. But at the age of 17, her life took a sharp turn. She gave birth to a son, whom they named after the child's father, Marlon, her boyfriend of 2 years. Despite their young age, Ashley and Marlon tried to raise the child together. At first, everything seemed fine, but in 2008, after finishing school, they moved in together. And when the young family was left to fend for themselves, things became difficult. Ashley had always wanted to pursue higher education, but had to give up on her dream so they could support themselves financially. Unfortunately, the young parents couldn't cope with the challenges and eventually separated. Her son remained living with Ashley. The situation she found herself in was very challenging, but she managed. She found housing for herself and her son, took on any odd jobs she could find, and slowly got back on her feet. Over the next few years, the young woman dedicated herself entirely to her son. However, she was still very young and must have felt that something was missing from her life. So, soon enough, Marcus Giles entered her life. Ashley and Marcus started dating and moved in together in Vancouver, Washington. While Ashley's family was initially glad to hear about the new man in her life, they began to notice changes in her. She, who had always been very open, preferred not to delve into the details of her new relationship. So only deeply concerning rumors reached her family. Marcus did everything to keep Ashley away from her family and friends, not allowing her to use their car, even though Ashley was the one paying for it, all the bills, and the apartment rent. In other words, the man was living off her money while dictating what she should do. Of course, Ashley's father and stepmother tried to bring up this issue during their rare meetings with their daughter, but there was little they could do as she was of legal age. In reality, things were much worse, and Ashley's parents found out about it in September 2013 when the terrified girl called her father. Through tears, she cried to Michael that Marcus had attacked her. She was locked in the bathroom and couldn't get out. Michael called Marcus and threatened him with physical harm if he didn't release his daughter. Immediately after the conversation with the young man, he contacted the police and rushed to Vancouver. When Michael arrived, Ashley and her son had already managed to escape from the apartment through the window. But now it became clear to him that his daughter was experiencing relationship violence. She had scratches on her face, a bruise under her eye, and a split lip. Ashley agreed to temporarily move out of the apartment, but soon everything returned to its place, and she continued living with Marcus. Her family tried to convince her to at least take a break from him, and sometimes it seemed like she was ready to do that. But months passed, and nothing changed. By that time, the decisions made by Ashley began to worry Marlon's father. He went to court regarding custody of the child, and the judge ruled in his favor. At the same time, Ashley's family was concerned that there was something in their daughter's life that they didn't know about. Unfortunately, their intuition was not wrong. Christmas of 2014 arrived. Ashley's son spent time with Marlon and his family, while the young woman herself came to give gifts to her relatives. She was brought by Marcus, but he sat in the car and didn't even enter the girl's parents' house. It seemed that Ashley was in high spirits, but she couldn't stay for long. Explaining that they planned to watch a movie with Marcus and maybe a few friends and have a quiet evening, she left. The rest of Ashley's family spent the rest of the holiday as usual. They couldn't even imagine that they had a reason to worry about the girl until the next morning, when Marcus called them. The young man informed them that he couldn't get in touch with Ashley. Michael and Jody knew that Ashley had a habit of letting her phone completely run out of battery. Plus, she never kept track of time. Usually, after a few hours, she would call back as if nothing had happened. They were confident that this was one of those cases, but they still began calling their daughter, trying to reach her. However, as time passed, their concern grew. It was at that moment they received a call. And this call not only shattered their world, but also explained why they felt that Ashley was hiding something from them. While Michael and Jody were increasingly anxious, a few kilometers away, the staff at the DoubleTree Hotel in Portland was experiencing a different kind of crisis. The morning started as usual during the busy holiday season, but then everything changed abruptly. Around 11 a.m., a hotel staff member found a body in the stairwell on the 8th floor. Just behind the door, he saw a young woman lying motionless on the floor. It was clear that she couldn't be helped anymore. When detectives arrived, they immediately noticed that the young woman was dressed inappropriately for the cold winter. She wore dark pants and a white blouse without a coat or jacket, and without shoes or socks. There were no bags, phones, or documents with her. Therefore, investigators assumed that she was a hotel guest, and her belongings must have been left in her room. She had no visible injuries except for marks on her neck, suggesting she hadn't fallen down the stairs, but was likely strangled. This assumption would soon be confirmed. The young woman's nails also caught their attention. It was clear that she had recently had a bright manicure for the holidays, but most of the nails on her left hand were broken, and there was no nail on her left index finger. However, they couldn't find any nails near her body. This led the police to conclude that they were dealing with a murder, and the victim had fiercely fought her attacker. But the murder didn't occur in the stairwell. However, after speaking with the hotel staff, the investigation hit a roadblock. No one could remember the victim. As far as they knew, no one matching her description had checked in or out. They also learned that a new surveillance system was being installed in the building, and the cameras weren't operational yet. This meant that the police had to rely on old-fashioned methods without the aid of video footage. With no other options, the officers started going room to room, knocking on doors and talking to guests. It was a time-consuming and challenging task, given that the hotel was nearly full on the holiday, and there were 10 floors to cover. They started with the rooms closest to the 8th floor, believing that the murderer likely wanted to move the body as little as possible to avoid drawing attention from potential witnesses. Most guests used the elevator, but someone from the staff could have used the stairs. Fortunately, the officers didn't have to go through all the hotel rooms. The front desk staff recalled that a woman had been calling them all morning, inquiring about her friend. She knew that her friend was staying in room 715 with a man named Chris. Officers asked the staff to check the registration log, and they found that room 715 was registered to a Chris Yoon. Chris Yoon had reserved the room for December 26th, but he had arrived a day earlier and asked if he could check in sooner, which was accommodated. He had paid in cash and left before the body was discovered, simply leaving the keys at the front desk without formally checking out. This situation raised an interesting legal nuance. Since the man had vacated the room on his own, they couldn't obtain a search warrant in his name because once he left, the room became public property. Fortunately, the hotel chose to cooperate fully with the police and allowed them to inspect the room. The room appeared relatively clean, with only 2 socks and a pizza box in the trash. However, while crime scene investigators were taking photographs, they made a chilling discovery: a piece of acrylic nail that matched the one found on the unidentified victim. Now, investigators were confident they were heading in the right direction. With heightened suspicions, the police turned their attention to Chris Yoon and discovered that he lived in a multi-apartment building in Bellevue, Washington. At the same time, officers discovered whether any calls had been made from room 715 and found another lead. Calls had been made from the room based on an advertisement posted on the Backpage website. This website often featured ads from women offering escort services, and this particular ad turned out to be one of those. The woman went by the name Veronica. The attached photos matched the victim found on the stairwell landing. Her real name was unlikely to be Veronica, but she wouldn't remain an unidentified victim for long. The floor-by-floor search had paid off entirely. Near an ice cream vending machine, officers found a purse, and in it were documents with a photo of the victim and the name Ashley Renee Benson. Detectives delivered the news to Ashley's family. They were utterly devastated. They had to confront not only their daughter's death, but also the fact that she had led a double life. The family had been concerned about her relationship with Marcus, but it turned out that there were far more difficulties in her life. They couldn't understand why she hadn't come to them with her problems. Given that her secret nightlife came as a surprise to them, they couldn't provide any information about how she ended up at the hotel. As far as they knew, she was planning to watch a movie with Marcus. However, they advised the detectives to speak with Marlon and Marcus. Marlon was quickly ruled out as a suspect. Since Ashley was killed on Christmas Day, Marlon had spent the day with his family and could prove it. He was aware that Ashley had been providing escort services. This was precisely why he had been fighting for custody of their son, and the judge had ruled in his favor. She believed that if Ashley couldn't make informed decisions for herself, she wouldn't be able to do so for her young son either. The judge also recognized that Ashley was a very intelligent, pleasant, and loving mother, and tried to reach out to her, explaining that such a lifestyle often led to negative consequences. It was like talking to a brick wall. On the other hand, it was understandable why the family's suspicions turned to Marcus. He had mistreated Ashley, and they suspected he controlled various aspects of her life. Investigators learned that Marcus had prior run-ins with the police, including assault charges. His alibi wasn't as solid as Marlon's. According to his statement, after dropping Ashley off at the hotel, he spent some time at home playing video games. And of course, no one could verify this. But before the detectives could fully digest this new information, they received yet another lead. And this one was simply incredible. They got a call from the hotel. Chris Yoon had just checked in again. When the detectives arrived at the hotel, the man was just leaving his room. They detained him. He couldn't understand what was happening but agreed to go to the police station. However, as they began to question him, the detectives quickly realized that something wasn't right. He seemed genuinely shocked that the police considered him involved in a murder. He had no knowledge of anyone named Ashley Benson, and most importantly, he hadn't been anywhere near the hotel until that day, December 26th. Furthermore, since everyone in the country was celebrating Christmas, he had plenty of witnesses, his family and friends, who could confirm that he was at home in Bellevue, Washington. He had a multitude of photos that corroborated his story, and he insisted that the police take his fingerprints and DNA. Chris explained that he was a DJ and had come to Portland for work, along with his fiancée. They had booked the room for December 26th, 2 months in advance. The detectives were baffled. Everything pointed to him as the killer, but Chris Yoon clearly couldn't have been in 2 places at once. Or could he? The detectives were beginning to realize that they would have to release their main suspect when suddenly one of them had an epiphany. He asked the man if he happened to know someone by the same name by sheer coincidence. Chris quickly replied no, but then he paused. In fact, in the same apartment complex in Bellevue, there was another Chris Yoon. The 2 men weren't related. What's more, their last names were spelled slightly differently, but pronounced the same. The detectives couldn't believe such an unbelievable coincidence. They pressed for details and found out that the man who arrived in Portland on December 25th had shown his driver's license with the name Tae Bum, Chris Yoon. The spelling of the last names didn't match, but he calmly explained that it was a typographical error. The hotel staff didn't find it strange. He paid in cash and went to his room. The detectives got even more incriminating evidence when they found Ashley's phone. The phone pinged, indicating that it was still somewhere near the hotel. The police combed the area and found it in a trash bin about a block and a half from the hotel. In it, they discovered a multitude of messages sent by Chris to Ashley. The messages revealed that Chris had been a regular client of Ashley's for several months, and he had called and messaged her dozens of times on Christmas Day alone. However, tensions had been mounting between them before her death. Part of it was about money, and part of it was because Chris had become increasingly possessive of her, pressuring her to leave her current lifestyle and become his girlfriend. Each time Chris met with Ashley, he showered her with thousands of dollars, gifts, and extravagant restaurant visits. In return, he demanded that she have no other men in her life. Shortly before her murder, Chris sent her an email in which he wrote, "I will clarify everything before you read my message. I am determined to compensate you for all the time you spent on me. Before you cast me as guilty, I want you to know that you broke our agreement. You posted a new ad, and though I forgave you, I found other ads." From this email, it was clear that Ashley had promised Chris that she wouldn't post escort ads anymore, but Chris had discovered that she had deceived him. Now, the investigators were convinced that they had not only found the person responsible for Ashley's murder, but also understood his motive. They suspected that on the night of the murder, Chris had demanded that Ashley quit escorting for good, but she refused, declaring that she didn't want to see him anymore. In a fit of rage, he strangled her and left her body on the staircase. Everything was falling into place, but there was an obvious problem. Nobody knew where Chris was. He wasn't at his apartment in Bellevue, which he had rented just a month ago, and it was nearly empty of furniture. Chris's parents believed he was attending college and had no idea where their son was. Meanwhile, detectives learned that early on the morning of December 26th, Chris had attempted to check into another hotel. He was sweaty, and his face and neck were covered in numerous scratches. The clerk asked him what had happened, and he replied that he had argued with his family and he needed a place to get away from them. Chris wasn't given a room because he wanted to pay in cash, so he called a taxi and checked into a different Portland hotel. When the police finally obtained a search warrant and tracked Chris's cell phone, they arrived at this hotel too late. He had already left. However, while in the hotel, he had called other women who provided escort services. Now, investigators were worried that if they didn't act quickly, they might have 2 murders on their hands. Studying Chris's life, the detectives knew he often traveled on Amtrak trains, shuttling between Washington and Oregon. This turned out to be one of the final missing pieces that would allow them to capture him. Around 2 weeks after Ashley's murder, on January 7, 2015, investigators learned that Chris had checked into another hotel in the Portland area and had purchased a ticket to travel to Washington on the same day. Police split into 2 teams, with one heading to the hotel and the other to the Portland Union Station. As they approached the hotel, the detectives saw Chris Yun exit the building and get into a taxi. They rushed inside and asked the clerk if he knew the taxi driver and if he had the driver's phone number. The clerk called the driver and discreetly asked where they were headed. The police couldn't believe it when they discovered that Chris Yun was returning to the scene of the crime. While sitting in the car, they speculated about his intentions. Some murderers liked to return to the scene of their crimes to relive the emotions they felt during the act. However, it was more likely that he simply wanted to retrieve Ashley's purse, which the officers had already found, because Chris quickly entered and exited the hotel without incident. He got back into the taxi and headed straight for the train station, where he was surrounded by officers. The first thing he said to them was, "How did you find me?" During the interrogation, Chris behaved quite calmly, politely, and even modestly. He admitted that he had always found it difficult to communicate with women. He met Ashley several months ago when he called her in response to an ad. Chris did want her to be his girlfriend, but he denied being obsessed with her. He described their encounter on December 25th and admitted that they had argued about money. However, as soon as the detectives began to ask questions about the murder, he clammed up and demanded a lawyer. But what was particularly interesting was that Chris talked about Marcus. According to Chris Yun, Marcus was not Ashley's boyfriend at all. He not only knew about her escort work, but he was behind it all, controlling her both emotionally and physically, and forcing her into this activity. While it might seem like an attempt on Chris Yun's part to shift responsibility onto someone else, by this point, he was not the only one making such statements to the police. Some of Ashley's friends who knew about her work were aware of Marcus's involvement in it as well. Clearly, Ashley became a victim of human trafficking. People like Marcus are often referred to as Romeo pimps. They pretend to be boyfriends, but in reality, they manipulate vulnerable girls, often young single mothers, making them fall in love and then exploiting them, forcing them to earn money for them. Although such allegations are challenging to prove, Ashley herself admitted during a custody hearing a few months before her death that the money she earned went towards covering all the expenses for both her and Marcus, including rent and a car, the very car she was not allowed to drive. Initially, Marcus denied any involvement in Ashley's work, but gradually, he changed his statements, eventually admitting who Chris Yun was and revealing that he had driven Ashley to the hotel on the night of her murder. However, despite all of the above, there was no evidence to suggest that Marcus was directly involved in the murder. Only he treated Ashley as his property, unfortunately, much like Chris Yun, spending thousands of dollars on her, sometimes even giving her more than $5,000 at a time. Chris believed he had the right to dictate what Ashley should do. According to the detectives, when he arrived at the hotel that night, even if he wasn't firmly intent on killing her, he didn't rule out that possibility. Therefore, according to the police's theory, He either hacked into the other Chris Yoon's email or somehow learned that the other Chris Yoon was coming to Portland and decided to use his booked room number, possibly even framing him, a namesake, for the murder. During the search of his apartment and his phone, the police found evidence that he was involved in the illegal drug trade. This explained where he got the thousands of dollars he often gave to Ashley, despite having no job, while his parents believed he was a student. Although he initially insisted on his innocence and stated that he would contest the charges against him, he later agreed to a plea deal. In 2017, Tae Bom Yoon, or as he preferred to call himself, Chris Yoon, pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter in the first degree and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. It is clear that he was not charged with any drug-related offenses, but the exact reasons for this are not entirely clear. It's possible that these were conditions of his plea deal. Charges of human trafficking against Marcus Giles were not proven in court. The Benson family filed a lawsuit against the owners of the hotel and the website where Ashley's advertisements were posted. Ashley's relatives claimed that these companies failed to conduct their business in a way that would prevent human trafficking, which ultimately led to Ashley's death. The Department of Justice subsequently closed the Backpage website, citing its facilitation and promotion of human trafficking. Unfortunately, the police discovered that whatever was happening in Ashley's life could have been going on for years. 4 years before her death, she was dating another guy, Latrell Poston, who was later charged with human trafficking. Latrell was 21 years old when he was sentenced to nearly 25 years in prison. Detectives revealed that he treated his victims as his property, much like Marcus did. Latrell also claimed to be Ashley's boyfriend, and even after his arrest, Ashley continued to send him profits from her work, although not always willingly. For example, according to court records, on August 11, 2011, Latrell called Ashley and asked where she was. She replied that she was doing a manicure at a salon. He then started shouting, if she doesn't put money into his prison account, he will beat her mother. How could she be so close to the prison and not bring the money? What did she feel? Ashley's father, Michael Benson, wondered, what did they say to her to make her do all these things or keep quiet about it? After their daughter's murder, Michael and Jody often received calls from other young women trapped in human trafficking. These women were looking for answers to their own questions. These girls feel like there is no way out, and at some point they will also be killed, Jody says. I tell them, I know you were threatened, but our daughter didn't turn to us for help, and look where it got her. It's one of those cases that leaves a dual feeling for a number of reasons. On one hand, it was a great example of coordinated and skilled police work. Detectives and prosecutors managed to find the killer and secure his conviction. On the other hand, it's disheartening that despite having a loving family that genuinely cared for Ashley, worried about her, and wished the best for her, most of the men in her life treated her as something to exploit for their own purposes. It makes you wonder if all the criminals involved in this case got what they deserved.
On February 19, 2001, at the Battlebridge Basin, a part of the Regent's Canal in London, 10 body parts belonging to an unidentified woman were discovered. The body parts were found in 6 different bags and weighed down with bricks. Who was she, and who killed her? These hastily dismembered remains belonged to an ex-girlfriend of John Sweeney, a jealous, perpetually drunken, and vengeful sadist. He referred to himself as a scalp hunter, but the press dubbed him the Canal Killer. Born John Patrick Sweeney on Saturday, October 13, 1956, the boy grew up in Kirkdale, a working-class district of Liverpool. Sweeney's childhood was unremarkable and devoid of significant events. Although his family was poor, his parents instilled in him a sense of pride, moral values, and the importance of hard work. The boy dreamed of studying art, but he was convinced to choose a more reliable profession. Thus, after training as a carpenter, for 5 years John traveled to different countries, working on construction sites with a bag full of tools, pockets full of cash, and eyes fixed on women. It was during this little-known episode of his life that something changed in John. When he returned to Britain several years later, he came back as an envious, jealous, and malicious person whose life was consumed by a passion for alcohol, illicit substances, and violence. Upon returning to Liverpool, John still looked like the boy who had left a few years earlier, with his tousled red hair and mischievous sparks in his eyes. But his almost childlike face, which always seemed kind and smiling, concealed a growing rage within him. After meeting the lovely Anne Bramley in 1976, John married her and moved in with her. Soon after, they had children. However, it was not a happy union. John was either absent from home and uninvolved in raising the children, or he behaved aggressively and horrifically abused his wife. He often used different aliases, such as Joe Johnson, Joe Carroll, or Liverpool Joe, to hide the increasing number of charges against him for various offenses. In 1979, after 3 years of marriage, concerned for the safety of her children and repeatedly reporting her husband to the police, Anne made a courageous decision and filed for divorce. 2 years later, she gave John one last chance, believing that he had changed, overcome his addiction, and that a bright future awaited them. But her husband had not changed. He was still intoxicated, drugged, and dangerous. And he was consumed by a desire for revenge. He was not going to allow her to leave him again. Their second marriage lasted barely a year. Anne escaped to her family in the middle of the night. But no matter how far she ran or how carefully she hid, John always found her. In November 1982, settling with her children in a cottage in a small town, Anne thought she had found refuge, but her peace was shattered because John Sweeney followed her. In the evening, when a piercing wind blew from the hills, covering the moon with dense clouds, and the snow crunched under his feet, John approached the new home of the family. Through a gap in the curtains, he noticed a light in the house but heard no sound and saw no movement. Realizing that nobody was home, the man broke the lock on the back door. Inside, seeing food on the table, children's toys on the floor, and family photos on the fireplace mantel, he felt even more acutely rejected by Anne. John slipped into the darkness of his wife's bedroom, opened the closet, and hid inside. And while he stood there, surrounded by familiar things, inhaling the scent of her perfume, surrounded by everything that reminded him of her departure, John waited for his wife's return with a hammer in one hand and an axe in the other. He didn't have to wait long. Just 2 minutes later, he heard the jingling of her keys. The front door opened, and light sequentially filled each room until he heard quiet footsteps in the bedroom. From the tension, the man's finger joints turned pale as he anxiously gripped the hammer and axe, prepared for a furious attack on his soon-to-be ex-wife. Waiting for the perfect moment, John burst out of the closet and saw 2 police officers in front of him, big, strong guys who already had handcuffs ready. John dropped the weapons, and thoughts raced through his mind about how to explain who he was and what he was doing in the closet with a hammer and axe. He claimed he was preparing a surprise for his wife. One can only guess what kind of surprise it would have been if the police officers hadn't shown up. However, luckily for Anne and the children, they were having a pleasant evening at the neighbor's house when they heard the sound as if someone had entered their home. Assuming it was a burglar, they called the police. John was arrested, but he was not charged with attempted murder or anything similar. Since it is difficult to prove intentions to commit a crime, and considering that everything happened in what could formally be considered his own home, the law couldn't do anything to him. He was released on the condition of staying away from Anne. John started over and moved to London. He returned to Liverpool only to visit his mother. Although he and Anne crossed paths more than once, they managed to maintain civilized relations for the sake of the children until her death in 2001. In the same year, 10 body parts, placed in 6 separate bags and weighted down with bricks, were dumped at the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London. But the body in the canal did not belong to Anne. John never again attempted to take her life. Perhaps he never had the opportunity again, perhaps he still loved her, or perhaps he knew it was wrong to deprive the children of a caring mother. Thus, with the same fury in his eyes, jealousy in his heart, and impatient tremor in his hands, John set off once again in search of love, an unsuspecting girl whom he would attempt to control. And her name was Melissa Halstead. But this time, he turned to his other passion, art, and his dark paintings would unveil the veil of mystery over his much more sinister plans. Born in Ohio, Melissa Halstead was a bright, courageous, and cheerful girl, whose free-spirited nature was balanced by kindness and inner warmth. Melissa always saw the best in people, and although it took her a long time to trust a stranger enough to become her friend, once you became her friend, you became her friend forever. At the age of 15, scouts from the renowned Ford modeling agency in New York took notice of the beautiful and striking girl, and that's where her career began. She traveled across America, Europe, and Asia. By 1986, after a successful modeling career and obtaining education as a makeup artist and photographer, Melissa settled in London in anticipation of a new chapter in her life. Melissa hardly told her family anything about her new boyfriend, whom everyone called Liverpool Joe. Whatever she saw in this red-haired, moody figure was a mystery to everyone, but whatever it wasn't worth it. Because the man didn't hesitate to disfigure her beautiful face, using his fists in fits of drunken rage. These were alarming signs, and Melissa repeatedly tried to leave. Over the course of 12 months of living together, Melissa and John Sweeney, the police were called to her rescue twice when he brutally beat her. But both times, John only received a slap on the wrist, forcing him to pay a fine of £5. In April 1988, the man frightened poor Melissa so much, waving a knife, that in a gruesome foreshadowing of her fate, she told her sister that if she ever disappeared, it meant John had killed her. This time, the court banned him from ever approaching the girl. Melissa's work visa was about to expire, and she continued to travel thousands of kilometers away from John, visiting Austria, France, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But no matter how far she went, how skillfully she hid, or how cautiously she noticed traces, he always found her. His paranoia fueled by alcohol, his jealousy fueled by rejection, and the court conditions that had no significance beyond Britain allowed him to track down his supposedly unfaithful girlfriend to her new apartment in Vienna, Austria. Without realizing that the shattered relationship was his fault, and driven mad by the thought that Melissa was cheating on him, John burst into the house through the back door, bound and gagged her neighbor, and searched the apartment. He examined every cabinet in search of signs of her infidelity. Melissa had learned from the experiences of his furious attacks. She knew there was no point in arguing, trying to convince him otherwise, or even dignifying him with a response. Instead, understanding that he needed time to cool down, she bought him a ticket to Amsterdam. Whether it was a clever ploy to distract a dangerous lover, a kind gesture to give him a chance to calm down, or an honest promise to resume their relationship is unknown. But it worked. John took the ticket and left. But a few days did not calm him down. On the contrary, he blamed Melissa for everything he had ever experienced because of women who deceived and rejected him. She rejected him like Anne, abandoned him like Anne, and destroyed him like Anne. John's anger came full circle, and it was time to finish what he had started, to seek revenge. On Friday, November 4, 1988, 4 days later and almost 6 years after the failed attack on Anne, John approached Melissa's apartment. Unlike that night, Melissa was at home. Unlike that night, he didn't break in but knocked on the door. Unlike that night, when Melissa saw her stalker had returned, an argument ensued. But just like that night 6 years ago in Anne's cottage, John was prepared. The knuckles of his right hand turned white with impatience as he clenched a hammer. He told Melissa that he had calmed down and simply forgot something in her apartment. Waiting for the moment when Melissa turned her back to him, John gritted his teeth, his hand shot up, and he brought down the steel edge of the hammer on the girl's head. Melissa felt a powerful blow, and her vision instantly darkened, but miraculously she survived. Lying in a hospital bed with bruises and a brain fracture, she declared that all she wanted was to help him, but now she understood that he truly hated her. John was arrested on the same day. Hatred for the girl continued to boil in him while in prison. In his troubles, he blamed only her. And here he resorted to his favorite pastime again, drawing. His drawings were not only frightening, realistic, and highly detailed, but they also served as a confession of the thoughts and desires that consumed him. His imagination was so deranged that it's hard to describe it in words. The most disturbing sketch he sarcastically titled Romantic Weekend 2 in Austria. But if it could be characterized in any way, it was certainly not romantic. However, Melissa knew nothing about the drawings. She believed his tears and assurances that she was all he had, so she took an unexpected step. The judge sentenced John to 12 months in prison and a 10-year ban on entering Austria to protect his victim from any danger. But he was released earlier after an emotional plea from the person he almost killed, Melissa. And on Monday, March 27, 1989, after serving only half of his sentence, 34-year-old John Sweeney walked free, inhaling the fresh Austrian air as the cold breeze played with his red beard. The stunningly beautiful blonde, a former model, kissed him on the lips. Melissa arrived in a car full of luggage to pick up John. They headed to the Netherlands, where they wouldn't be bothered by the deportation order, to start a new life together. However, those 6 months in prison did nothing to rid the man of his drinking habit, his use of illicit substances, his paranoia, jealousy, and his obsession with violence and torture. And their new home was as libertine and indulgent as it was an unsuitable place for someone like him. Although John occasionally worked, his earnings were only enough for alcohol, and it was Melissa's successful career that allowed them to pay for housing, food, and other expenses. Month after month, the beatings were repeated, which the girl concealed behind expertly applied makeup and poorly thought-out excuses. Thanks to her work as a photographer and makeup artist, she traveled a lot, but the more she was absent, the more John drank and filled himself with jealousy and rage. Finally, in late April 1990, Melissa returned home to Amsterdam, to the apartment she shared with her boyfriend. She decided to break up with him for good. On Thursday, May 3, 1990, in a coastal town called Rotterdam, located 50 miles from Amsterdam in the Netherlands, a military-style bag appeared on the surface of a canal. Upon seeing it, 2 police officers decided it was either stolen luggage or discarded trash. Inside, they found the torso of a naked woman. Just the torso, without hands, feet, or a head, and there were no belongings or documents present. The perpetrator had removed them and snapped the unfortunate victim's spine in half to fit her into the bag. She had spent just over a week in the water before being discovered. However, that was all the police could determine for certain because the killer had made maximum efforts to destroy all clues to her identity. The skull injury from a recent attack by her boyfriend could have provided a clue to her identity besides dental records, but all the police had was an unnamed torso, lacking any name, teeth, surgical scars, birthmarks, tattoos, or fingerprints. Since no missing persons matching her description had been reported in Rotterdam, Melissa was marked as Jane Doe and buried in an unmarked grave in a local cemetery. We will never know exactly how or where she died. We do not know how her killer transported her body from Amsterdam to Rotterdam. Perhaps he took a train, wondering what other passengers would think if they knew what was in his bag. But we do know that in Rotterdam, he chose a canal that ran through the heart of the city, waited for the opportune moment, and simply tossed the bag into the water. As Melissa worked a lot and traveled on assignments, her family in Ohio did not immediately realize they hadn't heard from her in a while. The last time she left a message on the answering machine, congratulating her mother on her birthday, and then she stopped calling. So in November 1990, the family hired a lawyer to investigate her disappearance. But they realized it too late. Her apartment was completely empty and meticulously cleaned, with no trace of the former tenants. Melissa had vanished, and John returned to Britain, embarking on his search for love, girls, once again. And her name was Delia Bamer. Having met John at a pub in early 1991, Delia was struck by the charisma of a man who lived a seemingly heavenly life. Being overly trusting by nature, she quickly allowed John to move into her apartment, just 1.5 miles from the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London's Paddington. But together they appeared to be a strange pair. She was a fragile blonde, a nurse who saved lives, and he was a red-haired psychopath with one past murder, one attempted murder, and at least one future murder. Delia brought warmth and coziness into the home, while John complemented it with illicit substances, alcohol, a tarantula, stacks of horror magazines, and a collection of gruesome paintings depicting scenes of violence, severed body parts, blood, torture, and headless female bodies. As before, he quickly revealed his true nature, striving to exert full control over Delia's life and exploding with rage if things didn't go the way he wanted. 2 years later, Delia gathered the courage to ask him to leave. He agreed, but he kept delaying the moment, continuing to exert control over every aspect of her life. In 1994, Delia managed to escape his watchful gaze and spent a day with a friend. When she returned, John flew into a rage. As punishment, he tied the helpless woman to her bed, using the same rope he had once used to bind Melissa's lifeless body. For unbearable 48 hours, he tortured Delia, repeatedly violating her, beating her, strangling her, and threatening her. John held a gun to her head and threatened to cut out her tongue with a kitchen knife if she screamed. In his frenzy, he began to tell her the story of his previous girlfriend, who had tried to leave him and supposedly met her end in the canals of Rotterdam. Allegedly, he caught her with 2 Germans. He killed all 3, not knowing what to do with them. He sat with the bodies for 3 days. On the 3rd day, he dismembered them, packed them into bags, and threw them into the canal. Delia had studied John well and didn't even attempt to argue, curse, resist, or scream. She didn't even allow herself to think about it, as if he could read her thoughts. Perhaps that's why, like Anne, he didn't kill her. And no one knows why. The man fled to Germany, but since the police knew his appearance and the fake names he used, he was arrested and deported back to Britain. Her tormentor sat in prison, but Delia was convinced that he would find a way to get to her sooner or later. On Thursday, December 26, 1994, 3 days before Christmas, John was put under house arrest. Just a few hours later, as the sun was setting, with a cold winter wind and snowflakes falling from the sky, Delia finished her shift and carefully rode her bicycle onto the road leading to her home. The dark street was empty, illuminated only by the flickering lights of television screens, Christmas garlands, and the dim orange glow of street lamps. Delia leaned her bicycle against the fence near the steps that led to her apartment entrance. It was quiet, peaceful, and safe, or so it seemed. As always, she propped the door with a brick and went back to get her bicycle. Delia was already halfway up the steps, looking around, asking herself if he was hiding in the darkness, when she glanced to the right again and saw his enraged face. Without wasting a second, Delia quickly pushed the brick, allowing the door of her house to slam shut right in front of her. She knew it was better to confront John on the street. If he pushed her into the house, she wouldn't stand a chance to escape. With raised hands, bulging eyes, and clenched teeth, John struck the fragile and defenseless woman with a 2-kilogram axe, while reaching for a knife. He hit her in the chest, piercing her lung, then her thigh, and swung the axe, severing the tip of his finger. Delia could have died, but she didn't. She pulled the bicycle towards her to shield herself from the blows. The sound of the axe scraping against the metal of the bicycle was heard by her neighbor, Giles Allen. Grabbing a baseball bat, he rushed out of his house and chased after John on the street. But John quickly vanished into the darkness, being the coward that he was, afraid to confront a worthy opponent, someone like himself. For the next 6 years, while John remained on the run, friends warned Delia to be cautious, believing that he would come back to finish what he started. But Delia didn't care anymore because she was no longer herself. And even though, after 6 years, 10 parts of a woman's body, carefully packed into 6 different bags, would be discovered at Battlebridge Basin, a London dock in the Regent's Canal, bearing a striking resemblance to Melissa's murder, Delia Bamer would not be the victim. That woman was still alive, because she still had to become John Sweeney's future ex-girlfriend. Having gone on the run, John didn't make much effort to lay low. He headed north, where he visited his mother, as well as his ex-wife Anne and their children. On January 2, 1995, just 11 days after the attack on Delia, John sent a letter to the police and Scotland Yard, boasting about his crimes and claiming they would never catch him. Since the red-haired butcher was easy to find, he decided to hide in another European country. He disappeared from all radars for 6 years. What happened to him during those years, where he was, what he did, and whom he possibly killed, remains unknown. The only certainty is that he returned to his gruesome drawings, promising brutal retribution against women who dared reject him. However, in early 2000, he came back to Britain, where he resumed his search for love. And her name was Paula Fields. As one of 11 children in a poor family living in the poorest district of Liverpool, Paula's childhood, along with her brothers and sisters, was challenging, but their troubles were only beginning. When Paula was 9 years old, her mother passed away, and the children were sent to relatives or placed in shelters. As she grew older, Paula tried her best to become a great mother to her own children. That's why she decided to move to London in search of a better life for her 3 sons, but things only got worse. After 2 years of constant hunger, suffering, and despair, she turned to the oldest profession. In the autumn of 2000, as a homeless woman of loose morals, with no chance of regaining custody of her children, who had been taken by Child Protective Services, Paula's life seemed to hit rock bottom. It was during this time that she met and fell in love with a bearded, red-haired butcher known as Liverpool Joe. Paula, battered and beaten, moved in with him. But what began as an endless cycle of emotional blackmail, psychological pressure, and physical violence soon led to her demise. At 9:30 a.m. on Friday, December 15, 2000, Paula was last seen entering John's apartment. Just 2 days later, the true nature of her beloved was revealed, and 2 days before he moved out of the rented flat, Paula was never seen alive again. On Monday, February 19, 2001, during the school holidays, 2 school children were fishing at the Battlebridge Basin when they noticed a partially submerged black bag. Being boys, they retrieved the heavy bag, hoping to find treasures or at least stolen valuable items. They were shocked for the rest of their lives when they opened the bag and found bricks and body parts. The police recovered 5 more similar bags from the water, but they did not find any hands, feet, heads, or any items or documents. Like Melissa, Paula could have become another Jane Doe, as John had once again gotten away with murder. Or he would have, if he hadn't made a huge mistake. He left one victim alive. Since the police became aware that the wanted assailant for the attack on Delia Bamer had been seen in London, all constables received his description. On Friday, March 23, 2001, the red-haired butcher Joe Johnson was spotted at a construction site. Knowing that he might be armed, the police had their most prepared officers. He indeed had a knife and a gun in his locker. In his apartment, they found more weapons, ammunition, machetes, a homemade bamboo garrote, a baseball bat, a wig with brunette hair, a change of clothes, an axe, handcuffs, garbage bags, a bag with saws and hammers, and over 200 drawings and poems depicting torture, dismemberment, and the death of women. For the attempted murder of Delia, John was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And although he boasted about many murders of his former girlfriends, as well as presumably 2 Germans whom he allegedly caught in bed with Melissa, without evidence, the law was powerless, and investigators feared that John would be released early from prison in a few years and simply disappear. But then another victim of John provided an important clue that helped remove the dangerous criminal from the streets forever. And she did it from beyond the grave. On June 12, 2007, thanks to the advancement of genetic technology, the Dutch police obtained the DNA of the woman whose torso was pulled out of the Rotterdam Canal 18 years ago. By joining forces, Scotland Yard and the Dutch police not only identified Melissa and Paula but also linked their murders, the method of disposing of the bodies, and the identity of the killer, John Swine. In court, the most reliable and crucial evidence against the defendant became his own paintings and poems. Detectives were able to establish a chilling connection between the drawings and the murders he was suspected of. In particular, on one drawing, investigators noticed an element hidden under correction fluid. Under ultraviolet light, forensic experts were able to see what was drawn there. It turned out to be a tombstone with the inscription, "Rest in peace, Melissa." But why would he hide this fragment of the painting if he considered all his works simply art? Because it was evidence. He knew about Melissa's death long before her remains were identified. Another painting titled "Beautiful Night in Vienna" depicted an army bag with something inside. It was in such a bag that Melissa was found. However, clues were provided not only by John's paintings. Two poems represented something like a biographical description of his relationship with Melissa, and two hinted or even explicitly spoke of the girl's death. For example, one poem ended with the line, "When I die, perhaps we will become one whole," meaning that she had died, and he knew it for sure. Although the press dubbed John Swine as the Canal Killer, he considered himself a scalp hunter, as he signed one of his works, an image of a man with a bloodied axe and a scalp with light hair. The hair most likely belonged to Delia, whom he dedicated the piece to, so to speak, wishing her to depart from life in the most painful way possible. The paintings depicting the murder of Paula were no less disturbing, and he continued to paint her even in prison. Although he was never tried for other murders, the police believe that John's drawings may contain clues to the identities of other victims, particularly two women whom the police have never been able to find. They did not find the other body parts of Melissa and Paula. Delia believes that John could have hidden them within the walls of the buildings he worked on as a carpenter. At least, that's what he did with his pet tarantula. On Monday, April 4, 2011, 54-year-old John was found guilty of the murders of Melissa and Paula. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Such a punishment is extremely rare in Britain, but the judge emphasized that Swine is too dangerous to ever be released again.
What motive for murder would you consider the most trivial? Betrayal, jealousy, or money? Don't rush to answer. This is a tricky question. After all, a jealous person might turn out to be greedy, and an unfaithful wife may burn with jealousy herself. When in a love triangle, each person has their own motive for murder, it won't be easy for the police to figure it out. And then even a killer who no one would dare to call very smart will manage to lead the investigation for 467 days. Growing up in Amarillo, Texas, Robin knew exactly what she wanted in life, even as a child. She wanted to stay at home and take care of her children while her husband provided for the family. Her parents, both military veterans, had a happy marriage that lasted for 40 years, and she dreamed of having a similar relationship. However, things didn't go as planned because she often chose the wrong partners and avoided the good ones as if they were a danger. But above all, Robin feared being alone. She hated being alone, and she was afraid of being alone. Fortunately, thanks to her sociable nature, she got a job as a waitress in a restaurant where there was no shortage of attention from men. And so one evening in 2003, at the age of 22, Robin met a wonderful young man named Jeremy David Spielbauer. Though everyone simply called him JD, 21-year-old JD was gentle, caring, and exceptionally polite. He served in the Marine Corps and had been deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. He also found work as a mechanic in civilian life. Needless to say, Robin fell head over heels in love with him. Just 2 months later, she joyfully announced to her parents that she and JD were expecting a child. Her parents had only just learned that she was dating someone, but they chose not to argue. Robin moved into JD's and his mother's house. After the birth of their daughter, they decided to get married. Soon, their second daughter was born. However, as is often the case, financial difficulties made life increasingly challenging for the growing family, and conflicts became inevitable. Then, to the surprise of their friends and family, the family began attending the local church about 3 times a week. There, they made new acquaintances, including a young mother of 2, Katie. The girls quickly became friends, but Robin's friend Aaron House looked with suspicion upon JD's newfound religious devotion. She believed that their church attendance was a more trivial reason, a desire to see Katie more often. Unfortunately, she was right. Robin stubbornly turned a blind eye to everything until the day her husband moved in with his lover. Approximately 8 years into their marriage, Robin filed for divorce and returned to live with her parents. JD and Katie got married on November 10th, the founding day of the Marine Corps. Now, JD helped Katie raise her 2 children, but it was clear that Robin hadn't forgotten her ex-husband until she became interested in Jared. It was evident that the young man genuinely liked Robin, and her friends, especially Aaron, were very happy for her. Robin at last regained her old self, rejoiced, and smiled happily, just like before. It seemed like a happy family and a cozy nest were on the horizon for the girl. But this glimmer of hope quickly dimmed one night in April 2014 when Robin got into her car and drove away, never to return home. On the morning of April 8, 2014, Robin's mother noticed her daughter was missing. She assumed that she had stayed with one of her friends, as she had done in the past, and felt somewhat irritated because she needed to go to work and didn't know who would take her grandchild to school. At that moment, it didn't even occur to her that something might have happened to her daughter. On the same day, around noon, a local businessman was driving on the highway when he turned onto Helium Road, and 3 girls ran towards him shouting, "She's dead! She's dead!" The man contacted the rescue service after the girls told him that they had seen a black Chevrolet Tahoe with a girl lying near the rear wheel. She wasn't breathing and wasn't moving. The officers who arrived at the scene concluded that the poor girl had been there for several hours and had suffered a blow to the head with a blunt object. She had no identification, wallet, or phone with her. However, the license plate of the vehicle helped identify the victim as Robin Spielbauer. Robin's parents had to break the terrible news to her daughters and her ex-husband. JD couldn't believe what had happened and couldn't hold back his tears. He immediately went to the family to support the children and his former in-laws. At the same time, the investigators were examining the crime scene. One unusual detail they noticed was the damage to the car's glass. The rear right door's glass had chips and bright pink paint marks. What did this suggest? It indicated that someone had struck the car's glass with a heavy and pink object. However, the detectives had no idea what significance this discovery would have in their investigation. Therefore, they began questioning Robin's acquaintances. Her boyfriend Jared stated that after work, he went home, played video games, and went to sleep. JD also claimed that he was at home, had 2 glasses of beer, and fell asleep. He hadn't come anywhere near Helium Road that evening and had no idea where Robin might have gone, why, or with whom. However, his phone told a completely different story. According to his text messages, he and his ex-wife were planning to meet that evening. The man had to admit that his wife had gone to her friend's place with their son. He had arranged to meet Robin at his home to discuss their children and wanted his uncle to be there in case his wife returned early. However, he forgot about the meeting and simply fell asleep on the couch after his uncle left. He woke up shortly before 10 p.m. with a strange, oppressive feeling. JD messaged his wife and his uncle, asking if everything was okay. At 10:18, he also messaged Robin, but she didn't respond. He tried calling her, but it went to voicemail. Just a few minutes after JD called his ex-wife, Katie arrived at the house. JD's uncle, who had returned to calm his agitated nephew, confirmed that she arrived around 10:20. They talked for a bit, as JD was still feeling uneasy. The detectives noticed that JD seemed to be trying to hint at something and directly stated that he was raising many suspicions. In response, the man claimed that he had his own suspicions but didn't specify what they were. The investigators had no doubt that JD was hiding something, and as they delved into his life, they discovered what it could be. JD had been married to Robin, but he had an affair with Katie. He then divorced Robin, married Katie, and started a new affair, this time with Robin. JD claimed they maintained friendly relations for the sake of the children, but Katie suspected there was more between him and his ex-wife. JD and Katie argued nearly every day, and Robin found it amusing. She wanted Katie to take her own medicine. The 2 women fought for a man they both considered a traitor, and what made him worth fighting for remained a mystery. Robin's friend Aaron even recalled an incident in 2013 when Robin came to Katie's house to pick up the girls. Katie grabbed and pushed her down the stairs, climbed on top, and started beating her. Robin managed to push her off. When Aaron heard about this, she warned her friend not to be alone with Katie because she was one of those crazies who could kill her. 5 months after that fight, Robin was dead. The investigators, of course, spoke with Katie. She admitted not liking Robin, but claimed she never threatened her. However, she stumbled on the same issue her husband did, her own text messages, and not just 1 or 2 messages. In the 4 days leading up to the murder, Katie sent her husband 336 angry messages. It was clear that she was furious and struggling to find a way to vent her anger. Less than an hour before the murder, she sent the following message to her husband. "My dreams of a happy family have evaporated. I won't force you to continue bearing this burden. You started it, whether you want to believe it or not. I will end it." Statements like these, in the eyes of the investigators, turned the jealous wife into a murder suspect. However, Katie had not only a motive, but also an alibi. She and her son spent the evening at her friend Savannah Guinness's house. They left around 10 p.m. and returned home at 10:20, which was confirmed by JD and his uncle. Furthermore, there was no evidence connecting her to the crime scene, at least not at that point. On the same day that investigators were interrogating Katie, the forensic expert conducted an autopsy on Robin. At the crime scene, it appeared that she had died from a severe blow to the head with a blunt object, but the autopsy revealed something more. A .22 caliber bullet had been fired into the back of the victim's head. Now the police began searching for the weapon. Robin's parents, who lived just a few houses away from Katie and JD, watched as the police conducted a search in their former son-in-law's home. The family had an entire arsenal in the house, which was quite common for Texas. However, one small detail caught a lot of attention: a pistol with a bright pink frame, the same caliber as the bullet that killed Robin. A piece of plastic had broken off the pistol. Therefore, the investigators returned to the crime scene and combed the area around where they found the car. They discovered a .22 caliber shell casing and 2 bright pink plastic fragments that obviously matched the pistol. What was particularly intriguing was that before they found the weapon, but after the murder, the investigators had browsed Katie's Facebook page and found a photo of her shooting the very same pink pistol. However, before they could realize the significance of this discovery, she deleted the photo. It seemed like Katie didn't want the police to know about the weapon. But why? Detectives took a closer look at where she was at the time of the murder. You may remember, she had an alibi. She and her son spent the evening with Savannah's family and left at 10 p.m. However, Savannah told them that Katie and her son had left at 9:50 or around that time. Just 10 minutes, but they were crucial. It only takes from 3 to 5 minutes to drive from Savannah's house to Helium Road. These 10 minutes cast doubt on Katie's alibi, and her best friend was the one who brought it to light. There was more. At 10:13, Katie's phone pinged at a tower that could be considered close to both Savannah's house and the crime scene. This meant that Katie had the means, opportunity, and motive to commit the murder. The police believed they had everything they needed for an arrest. They arrested Katie in front of her 12-year-old son, Diego. By the way, as all witnesses confirmed, Katie was with her son the entire evening. Wouldn't he have noticed if his mother had stopped the car in the middle of a field, had an argument with someone, and then committed a murder? Especially since Robin had not only been shot, but also struck with a blunt object on the head. The teenager surely would have noticed. But when he was questioned, he said that all he remembered was sitting in the car with his mom and playing games on his phone while they drove around the city. Thus, on April 11, 2014, just 4 days after the murder, the investigators informed Robin's parents about the arrest. Robin's loved ones lost a daughter and a friend. But the consolation for them was that the person responsible for her death, Katie Spielbauer, was behind bars. Is the case closed? Not quite. Katie remained in jail, unable to post bail, while investigators and District Attorney James Farron built their case against her. They soon received assistance from an unexpected source. JD came to the police station and stated something he had maintained all along. He had been at home with his uncle when he received a message from Robin proposing a meetup on Helium Road. This time, JD added to his story by saying that just after 9 p.m., Katie returned home. She was in a bad mood and started an argument. JD, not wanting to fight, went to his bedroom and lay down. When he woke up, he found that his wife had left in his car. That was when a terrible feeling of dread overcame him, and he decided to check if everything was all right. JD and his uncle received responses from Katie, confirming everything was fine, but there was no response from Robin. When the detectives asked JD why he decided to tell them about this now, he explained that the thought of his wife being involved in Robin's murder was driving him insane. The investigators challenged JD's story, which contradicted phone records available to the police. JD's phone pinged at 9:23 while he was on his way to the crime scene. JD then explained that someone else had taken his phone and his car. It was Katie. She saw his messages with his lover and took his phone, his car, and went to confront Robin. But why did Katie hit the car's rear right window with a gun? The detectives were convinced that it was likely the lovers had met on Helium Road, sitting in the back seat of the car when Katie arrived. She fired her gun before JD could react, and now he was torn between his loyalty to Katie and his desire for justice for Robin. After a few more days, JD finally agreed to tell everything. JD and Robin had met on Helium Road, sitting in the car and just talking about the kids. When they noticed headlights approaching, they heard a loud knock on the window, obviously not made by a fist. JD opened the door, and it was Katie. The girls immediately started arguing. JD demanded they stop fighting and reassured Katie that they were just talking about the children. He then went to his car and drove home, convinced that Katie would follow him. But he was wrong, so he sent 2 text messages, asking if everything was okay. JD explained that he hadn't told anyone earlier because he didn't want to believe it, as he still loved Katie, but now it was all over. He filed for divorce and never visited his wife in jail, as she was going to be there for a long time unless she could prove her innocence. When investigators took on the case, it seemed simple and straightforward. It took them 4 days to link Katie to the murder. The prosecutor believed that after some time in jail, Katie would confess. However, even her husband's admission didn't help. Katie demanded a polygraph test. The police provided her with that opportunity and she took another one. She failed it miserably, but it didn't break her. She still refused to confess. Katie didn't deny her animosity towards her rival, but claimed she would never kill her or arrange someone else to commit murder. The reason lay in her tragic upbringing. Her father died when she was 2, and she buried her mother at 18. Knowing the hardships of growing up without parents, she would never do such a thing to Robin's children. All the evidence against Katie was circumstantial, and they needed something more solid. That's when a breakthrough happened. In the prosecutor's office, someone mentioned a case where smartphones could leave digital footprints when connecting to Wi-Fi networks. Katie's phone had its Wi-Fi turned off, but her son Diego's phone had it on. This meant that investigators could track Diego's every move and consequently that of his mother that night. Since all the witnesses consistently stated that the teenager was always with his mother, tracing Diego's phone could lead them to Katie. The prosecutor instructed his assistants to obtain this information, and it took months to do so. When the data was finally acquired, the prosecutor met with Katie. By that time, she had spent 467 days in jail, awaiting trial. The prosecutor told Katie that he considered this information the final piece needed. He was confident that it would send her to prison for life, but it turned out to be the key to her freedom, allowing her to reunite with her children. She couldn't believe it, breaking down in tears due to the overwhelming emotions. She admitted that during her time in jail, she had harbored the darkest thoughts, fearing that if she were found guilty, she would have to be carried out in a body bag. She would prefer her children to believe their mother had passed away rather than having her incarcerated for murder. Suddenly, with the snap of fingers, she was free. Within hours, the case against her was closed, and she was released. A happy ending? Not quite, as if Katie was innocent. It meant that someone else got away with murder. The prosecutor publicly admitted his mistake. He realized that JD had outsmarted him simply because everyone underestimated him, believing he wasn't clever enough to orchestrate a murder. Although there was a small arsenal in his home, he chose the pink gun, which often jammed after the first shot, solely because it belonged to Katie. He could have disposed of it in the desert where it might never be found, but he brought it back home. Moreover, surveillance cameras captured a car similar to his near the crime scene at approximately the time of the murder. Although the face and license plate weren't visible, investigators were convinced it was JD behind the wheel, and no car remotely resembling Katie's was seen there. But the most significant lie he told was not about the night of the murder, but his past. JD had never served in the Marine Corps or any other military branch, nor had he been to Iraq or Afghanistan. All those stories were fabrications to impress women like Katie, whose parents had military ties, something that spoke volumes about his character. The prosecutor was certain that at some point before Robin's murder, she had told JD that she had met someone else and they would no longer be lovers. Additionally, she had expressed her desire to finally receive full child support payments. JD's scheme was simple: kill Robin to get rid of her, frame Katie to eliminate her as well, and then remain financially stable while finding a younger and more agreeable girlfriend. This would solve all his problems. However, the prosecutor hesitated to press charges, and 9 months later, Robin's mother called him. It turned out JD had asked her to do him a favor and buy him a ticket to New York, claiming he needed to go there for the weekend. Presumably, he planned to flee since it was just a short distance from New York to the Canadian border. This prompted the prosecutor to take action, but an arrest doesn't equal a conviction. That's why he took another unexpected step by inviting Katie as a witness in the case. The prosecutor was confident that his earlier mistake would now help convict JD. Robin was killed with a pink gun, and either JD or Katie had to be the murderer. It was certainly not Katie. The defense argued that if Robin had been severely beaten and then shot, it pointed towards Katie as the perpetrator because both actions could have killed her, suggesting the murderer was in a state of rage. Moreover, JD couldn't have framed Katie easily because he wasn't smart enough for such a plan. If he wanted to frame his wife, he would have ensured that she had no alibi. JD could have been sentenced to death if the jury believed that the crime included a robbery because Robin's phone and wallet went missing, and later, her daughter's documents were found in JD's car. However, the jury decided that this was more likely a theft than a robbery. Therefore, he was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after April 20th, 2046, when he would be 63 years old. Justice was served for Robin, but her parents still felt the pain of the thought that their daughter's greatest fear came true when JD left her alone on that remote road. In January 2020, the case took an unexpected turn. The appellate court overturned JD's conviction. It turned out that 2 jurors had formed opinions about the defendant and the case before the trial, which was not allowed by the procedure. Additionally, JD had complained about the performance of his lawyers. In 2021, the court found no issues with the jury selection process. However, the case was once again sent back to the appellate court to assess JD's complaint about his attorneys. It's important to note that the appellate court did not conclude that the man was innocent, but rather that there was a procedural error. Even if JD's trial is conducted again, Katie, who currently works at a law firm, has promised to be present on behalf of Robin to ensure that justice prevails once more. Katie herself has become the director of a company that helps teenagers and adults overcome emotional and physical traumas and change their lives for the better through sports. Unlike other serial killers, he was considered an anomaly, a maniac who didn't fit the typical profile of a bloodthirsty, evil, uncontrollable murderer. Instead, he was someone who sincerely felt remorse and wished to remain locked away for life, wanting to prevent harm to anyone else. He cried out for help, yet no one came to his aid. What in his life made him the way he became? Let's delve into the story of a man let down by estranged parents, a troubled upbringing, and a flawed law enforcement system. This is the tale of a serial killer known as the Deranged Dave. David Edward Maust was born on April 5, 1954, in Connellsville, Pennsylvania, to George and Ava Maust. Apart from David, the family had 3 other children. The family's life was challenging. Both George and Ava had difficult childhoods themselves. His father was put up for adoption at the age of 12, and thus the parents didn't know how to create a loving home for their own children. George was often absent from home, trying to stay away from his wife, who required constant attention, was emotionally unstable, and self-centered. Right after the birth of David's younger brother Jeffrey, their mother was hospitalized for a month due to a nervous breakdown. It's possible she suffered from postpartum depression, but at that time, medicine didn't have much understanding or help for women in such conditions. In 1963, when David was only 7 years old, his parents divorced. Evidently, the divorce was initiated by David's father, as he had stopped supporting his ex-wife and the 4 children for a year, leaving the woman to take care of the family on her own. David's sister later recalled that life at their parents' home was difficult for all the children, but David had it the hardest. Perhaps because he bore a strong physical resemblance to his father, and since their mother despised her ex-husband, her hatred transferred onto her son. Eva claimed she couldn't control the boy. Allegedly, by the age of 8, David had tried twice to kill his brother Jeffrey, once by pushing him into the water in a lagoon and stepping on his fingers so he couldn't climb out, and another time by attempting to set Jeffrey's bed on fire. His mother also claimed she often checked her son's pockets because he might have stolen things from other people. According to her, he would steal her valuables and sell them, all of which supposedly occurred before he turned 9. Because when he turned 9, Eva declared that she no longer wanted to deal with a difficult, problematic child. She approached the court, stating that she needed help because he was mentally ill, and the 9-year-old child was admitted to an institution for the mentally ill. However, the staff and doctors noticed no signs of behavior as described by Eva. Rather, they concluded that the mother had simply abandoned her son. If life at home was already difficult for the boy, it became even worse. He had to share common spaces with dozens of other people, patients with schizophrenia, developmental disorders, and aggressive criminals. David felt anger and incomprehension. He felt he had nowhere to go because both his father and mother had abandoned him, and he found himself trapped. On visitation days, he stood by the window hoping to see his mother, who never appeared. The institution's staff tried to console him, making excuses for why his mother wasn't there, claiming she was unwell or had some other reason for not showing up. After some time, the boy resigned himself to his situation. He and the other children simply imagined that their parents needed a break. In reality, they hadn't been abandoned. In David's case, it didn't resemble the truth, but partly, the children were right. During those times, such institutions were used, as horrifying as it may sound, to essentially leave a child there. David later recalled a boy who regularly spent summers at the clinic because his parents sent him to the mental institution, treating it as a summer camp while they themselves went on vacation. Miraculously, when they returned from vacation, their son somehow recovered from his mental illness. Doctors quickly assessed how intelligent David was. He always articulated his thoughts clearly and demonstrated exceptional abilities, vividly recalling sporting events. Because of this, the medical staff soon suspected that it was Eva, David's mother, who suffered from a mental disorder, not her son. They waited for her to get better so they could send David back home. However, every time they tried to organize the child's return home, his mother rejected him. When the boy turned 13, the clinic staff had no choice but to officially acknowledge that David had no mental abnormalities. However, he still had nowhere to go. Consequently, he was transferred to a children's home located just a few blocks away from his family's home. It must have been very painful for him to realize that his relatives lived nearby but didn't want anything to do with him. However, David found himself in a shelter with other boys going through adolescence, and since they didn't have the opportunity to interact with the opposite sex, it was quite natural for them to experiment in relationships with each other. As soon as David appeared in the children's home, another boy began demanding his attention. He was very persistent and blackmailed David by threatening to tell everyone about his stay in the mental institution. David resisted, but later in his diary, he would write that he gave in and kissed the young blackmailer, after which he immediately felt disgust and anger towards himself. Except for this incident, David settled quite well into the shelter. David Maust was inherently very intelligent, and even with the hardships he faced, his difficult childhood, time in the clinic, and the shelter, they couldn't affect his ability to learn. He didn't lose concentration and impressed others with his phenomenal memory. Life seemed to be improving, until suddenly, a feeling of rage began to awaken within him. By the age of 15, David assaulted another boy, Eddie. They were playing together when, for unknown reasons, David started to choke Eddie. Eddie nearly died, but David suddenly stopped upon realizing that Eddie was almost not breathing. He asked for forgiveness, and Eddie forgave him. Was this repentance sincere? It's unclear, as David may not have wanted trouble having nowhere else to go and trying to control himself. However, we know about this incident because he described it in his 87-page diary that he wrote in prison. Nonetheless, his self-control did not last long, as David soon attempted to strangle another boy, Daniel. They were in a room together, simply watching TV, when David grabbed a rope and wrapped it around Daniel's neck. Again, he stopped when he realized Daniel hadn't done anything wrong to him. I told myself enough, released the rope, and Daniel fell to the floor, he wrote in the diary. It was as if I was trapped inside myself and someone else was trying to kill Daniel, and I couldn't stop. He was contemplating his actions, convincing himself that it was wrong. David began to think that he couldn't control his actions or thoughts, which was probably terrifying for a teenager whose life lacked a normal parental model. Daniel survived but reported the incident, leading David to be returned to the institution for the mentally ill. Life seemed to promise improvement when the teenager turned 17. Along with a few other guys, he escaped from the clinic and decided to return home. To his immense disappointment, Eva had gotten married, and there was no place in her home for her unwanted son. Moreover, she told everyone that David was a disgrace to the family, and even pretended that he had never existed. To get rid of him, she convinced him to join the army. It's important to understand that it was 1971, amid the Vietnam War, but perhaps, for the boy, it wasn't the worst option. To give him something to do in life, a place to live, and useful skills, his mother sent him to the recruiter. David was accepted into the army and sent to Frankfurt, Germany. He served as a cook at a military base where civilians also lived. Among them was 13-year-old James McLister, whom everyone called Jimmy. His parents worked as engineers on the base. David and Jimmy met at the bowling alley. In the army, David discovered another talent. He played bowling superbly, participated in competitions, and earned decent money from it. David and Jimmy became friends and hung out until one evening, David woke up in his bed, naked with Jimmy. He erupted in anger. He suggested Jimmy go for a ride on a moped. Obviously, the boy trusted him completely, regarded him as an older brother, and fearlessly went along. If only he knew what David was thinking. They drove quite far from the base and reached a place where there remained a crater from a bomb from World War II. There, David tied Jimmy to a tree and beat him with a plank he found there. When Jimmy stopped breathing, his killer simply untied the body and left it there. David returned to the base and pretended as if nothing had happened. Of course, they searched for the boy, but found him only a month later. David was detained, but somehow convinced the court that it was an unfortunate accident. Supposedly, the boys damaged the moped and Jimmy crashed from it. David got scared, didn't know what to do, and just hid Jimmy's body. He was believed there was no evidence of murder, and David was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Interestingly, in prison, David behaved perfectly, earned a diploma, wrote to his family every week, and acquired new useful skills. His behavior was so exemplary that he was allowed to be considered for early release on parole, but he declined the offer. The young man began to understand what he was capable of and was afraid to be free. In confinement, he had plenty of time to reflect on what he had done, and he realized that if he were released, he would definitely kill someone else. He despised himself for such thoughts and feelings because they caused him revulsion. His lawyer later called him one of the most remarkable serial killers because he had a conscience. He felt sorry for killing people, sorry even until the moment when he killed again. He hated himself for what he had done. However, the thirst for murder returned, and he succumbed to it, killing again. It's a very peculiar pattern of behavior. Nevertheless, he was released in 1977 when he turned 23 years old. 2 years later, he settled in Chicago and befriended a teenage boy. Well, befriended is how it seemed. But sometimes when the boy stayed overnight, David had the desire to stab him. After another evening when they drank and the teenager fell asleep on the couch, David gave in to this uncontrollable urge. He stabbed him in the abdomen with a knife, almost disemboweling him, but the teenager survived. David was tried for attempted murder. On the witness stand, he lied, and he was found not guilty. What he said to make them believe him remains unknown. Perhaps he had another talent, being devilishly convincing when necessary. By the age of 27, David had failed to learn how to control his desires. In an attempt to understand what was happening to him, he recalled the kiss at the orphanage when a boy approached him. He speculated that this negative, intimate experience was the cause of his bad behavior. Therefore, he decided to find that boy, now a man, and kill him. He believed that by doing so, he could put an end to his destructive tendencies and desires. Thus, he set out on a hunt to direct his rage toward this man. However, upon arriving at the place where the boy used to live, he discovered that the man was in prison. So David wasn't the only one who, upon leaving that orphanage, ended up in trouble. He couldn't unleash his rage on his offender or suppress the urge to kill. Then, he spotted a boy, 15-year-old Donald Jones, completely innocent, who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, simply passing by his car. David convinced the teenager to get into the car under the guise of some simple, odd job and drove him to a remote area with quarries. Similar to his previous victim, he inflicted several stabs on Donald's abdomen. Later in his diary, he wrote about how the boy begged not to be killed, repeating, "Don't kill me, I'm only 15 years old." However, David couldn't stop himself. He then took the teenager to the waterlogged part of the quarry where he left him. Unable to escape on his own, the teenager perished. David decided not to wait for the body to be discovered and left the town. He knew that his uncle lived in Galveston, Texas. His uncle allowed David to stay with him and found him work in his construction company. Again, David proved himself as an excellent worker, but his uncle fired him when he accidentally damaged the company's van. Things got worse. He invited a 14-year-old boy to his hotel room, offering alcohol and illegal substances, but instead began beating him. Suddenly he stopped. As if the normal David took over and caught himself in this horrible act. He dropped the weapon and burst into tears, feeling ashamed. The boy survived, and David received a 5-year sentence. While in prison, he again thought that if released, he would continue killing. Investigators now started connecting him to the case of Donald, and in 1982, he was extradited to Chicago in connection with Donald Jones's murder. For a long time, they didn't find him fit to stand trial, returning him to a psychiatric clinic. However, after 10 years of awaiting trial, David admitted his guilt in 1994. He was sentenced to 35 years. The Cook County prosecutor wrote a report to the Illinois Department of Corrections, stating that he was the most dangerous inmate they would have. The sheriff even described him as a criminal equal to John Wayne Gacy. Nevertheless, due to David Maust waiting for trial and extradition for 12 years, his sentence was reduced by 12 years. Given his exemplary behavior as a prisoner, an additional 2 years were also deducted from his remaining sentence. David didn't want to be released and even wrote a 6-page letter to the Illinois Department of Corrections admitting that he couldn't control himself, wanted to stay in prison, and asked not to be released. At that time, there was a law in Illinois that allowed a convicted person to voluntarily remain in prison for life as a sexually violent offender. David was offered this option and replied in the letter, "Bring the papers, I will sign everything." But nobody came to him. According to his lawyer, the letter wasn't even read, and in 1999, he was released from custody. After another release, David moved to Oak Park, Illinois. He hoped that a new place of residence would allow him to start over, but just a year later, he attacked his friend Anthony by hitting him on the back of the head with a metal pipe. One might think that this time the police would take more serious action against him. However, no charges were even brought against him because Anthony was a former gang member who didn't want to involve the police and refused to testify against David. In 2002, when his parole ended, David decided to move again, this time to Hammond, Indiana. He found a job nearby, often frequented by and involving teenagers. By then, employers could already check the backgrounds of those they hired. Despite David's history of victimizing teenagers, he was simply allowed to work alongside young boys. He quickly resumed his old habits, visiting places where teenagers hung out, such as public pools. He offered the boys opportunities to earn money by giving them seemingly simple tasks. No teenager would refuse to earn some money by doing a seemingly easy task, but these tasks turned out to be sinister. This continued until Michael Dennis, 13 years old, and James Regagni, 16 years old, disappeared. David had met these boys that summer at the public pool and befriended them, inviting them over to his place. The last time they were seen was on September 10, 2003. When the boys vanished, the police initially assumed they might have just run away, especially considering Michael and James were rebellious. Therefore, the disappearance of these two boys didn't receive as much attention as the disappearance of 19-year-old Nick James on May 2, 2003. Nick James was not rebellious, and his family had been pressuring the police for several months. Investigators learned that he worked at a store with David Maust and checked his background. As they lacked evidence, they asked him to take a polygraph test, which he passed. He claimed not to have seen them for some time, which was essentially true. They didn't, however, ask if he had killed the boys. Despite passing the polygraph, investigators decided to search David's house. The officer with a canine, Emo, worked in 2003 with the purpose of finding bodies. The police invited the dog and its handler to search David Maust's basement. When the officer gave Emo the command, the dog began barking at the far wall of the basement, though it had been trained to act as if it were digging. The handler explained to investigators that this behavior was odd because the dog was doing something contrary to its training, But breaking the concrete and seeing what was behind it was necessary, as there must be a reason the dog wouldn't leave that particular spot. A week later, they were asked to return to the same house. Officers drilled a deep hole in the floor and found nothing. They circled to another side, drilled a longer hole, yet still found nothing. So they gave up. They asked them to return again with the dog. This time, Emo immediately approached the hole and lay down. The officer couldn't capture this on video and asked the handler to command the dog again. Then the dog moved to another hole and lay down once more. Police brought in a concrete specialist and found out David had used an enormous amount of concrete, around 80 bags or so. Obviously, this was done to hide something, presumably bodies. Finally, the police removed the concrete and found 3 bodies. David had suffocated James and Michael in his apartment and buried them under the basement with Nick. Suddenly, David's mother and brother, who had not spoken to him for many years, appeared. Jeffrey gave many interviews, questioning whether what happened could have been prevented if the police had paid attention to David earlier. He spoke about terrible things that his brother allegedly did in childhood, but he had no evidence. Moreover, his mother and brother, who had not communicated with David for many years, seemed to thirst for fame, and Jeffrey even wanted to write a book. His attorney, Thomas Wayne, stated that David was indeed a serial killer, but he wasn't born one. The attorney sincerely believed that if someone sought the recipe for creating a serial killer, then his childhood was precisely that. He never learned to live in society or communicate with other people. In November 2005, David pleaded guilty to the murders and was sentenced to 3 life imprisonments. In January 2006, at the age of 51, David passed away. A note was found in his cell where he confessed to 5 murders, including 3 in Hammond. He wrote how disappointed he was not to have been sentenced to death because he felt he deserved it. He believed that if he had been kept away from society, he wouldn't have committed as many crimes as he did. Additionally, he didn't want taxpayers to pay for his existence. He asked for forgiveness from the victims' families and took responsibility for everything he had done. He didn't blame his parents or upbringing, only himself. David wrote that he loved his family, but they never reciprocated.
On the afternoon of September 23, 2007, the Miami Coast Guard responded to a report from Jeff Branham, owner of the fishing vessel Joe Cool. The boat had not returned from a trip to Bimini, the closest island in the Bahamas, located approximately 25 kilometers east of Miami. In principle, there was nothing unusual about the boat not returning on time. Passengers might get carried away with fishing or have a bit too much to drink and need to sleep it off, often asking the captain to stay out a little longer, which naturally leads to delays. Jeff Branham reported that 6 people were on board, 4 crew members and 2 passengers. It was an experienced team, typically helping tourists catch big fish, particularly tuna. However, the passengers this time were somewhat unusual. The 2 men were not interested in fishing at all. They had simply booked a one-way trip to Bimini. The captain was somewhat puzzled and directly pointed out that a short flight would cost them much less. Why book an expensive ocean trip instead? It turned out that the men could not fly because one of their girlfriends had accidentally packed his passport in her luggage. The girlfriends were now waiting for them on Bimini in another boat. The men agreed to pay $4,000 for the 2.5-hour journey. The captain was still unsure whether to take the job, but his uncle and co-owner of the boat, Jeff Branham, convinced him to accept. It was an international trip, which meant the company could later advertise trips to the Bahamas in its service offerings. Additionally, Jake and the crew could enjoy the opportunity to fish on their way back. On Saturday, September 22, 2007, the Joe Cool set off from the dock. Another very important trip was scheduled for the following day. The boat needed to be prepared in advance, so it was crucial for the crew to return on time. However, the next morning, when Jeff Branham expected to find the boat at the dock, it was nowhere to be seen. It was highly unlikely that the captain had intentionally extended the boat's stay at sea, knowing that other clients were waiting. Jeff called the port in the Bahamas and was horrified to learn that the boat had never arrived there. Since no issues on board had been reported, he found this extremely strange and contacted the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard began their search, and to better understand what might have happened on the boat, they investigated the crew members. All 4 crew members, Jake Branham, Kelly Branham, Scott Gamble, and Samuel Sammy Carey, were residents of South Florida. Jake and Kelly Branham were in their early 20s, a married couple raising 2 children. Their eldest daughter was 3 years old, and their youngest son was just 4 months old. Jake had dreamed from a young age of becoming the captain of his own boat, running fishing charters and tourist trips. Luckily for him, his family was very wealthy, and his grandfather provided the funds to purchase his first boat and set up the business. Jake acquired a 14-meter sport fishing vessel designed to handle rough seas. The boat was equipped with everything needed for tuna fishing, making it a top-notch vessel, perfect for catching big fish and hosting tourist trips. Jake's uncle, Jeff Branham, was listed as co-owner of the boat, while Jake's cousin assisted with administrative work. Jake's older brother, Scott Gamble, and a close family friend, Samuel "Sammy" Carey, joined the crew. By 2007, after just a few months in operation, the business was thriving, attracting many clients thanks to Jake's expertise in finding the best fishing spots. Kelly, Jake's wife, didn't always accompany the crew on trips. However, this short journey seemed too appealing to pass up. So Jake and Kelly asked Jake's grandfather to babysit their kids. At the scheduled time, the couple boarded the boat along with the rest of the crew and their passengers, and they set off on their voyage. The Coast Guard disseminated all critical information about the Joe Cool to nearby vessels, including a description of the boat, the number of people on board, and the purpose of its trip. Coast Guard patrol boats scoured the route the vessel was supposed to have taken, but there was no sign of it. They had no idea what might have happened to the boat. Other sailors, friends of the missing crew, joined the search effort. While the families of the crew members were undoubtedly worried, there was hope that everything was fine since Jake, Samuel, and Scott were highly experienced seamen. However, when the Joe Cool wasn't quickly located, an official search and rescue operation was launched. Helicopters took to the skies, and a plane flying the route between Miami and Bimini was also enlisted in the search. The likelihood of finding the Joe Cool was high, as the area was frequently patrolled due to its reputation as a corridor for illegal activities, such as the smuggling of migrants, particularly from Cuba, and contraband. Predictably, it wasn't long before sailors aboard a Coast Guard vessel spotted a fishing boat. However, all attempts by officers to contact the vessel went unanswered. As the ship drew closer, the crew saw the name on the boat, Joe Cool. It was indeed Jeff Branham's missing vessel, but the circumstances surrounding the boat baffled rescuers. The Joe Cool was drifting nearly 50 kilometers north of Cuba, about 225 kilometers off course. For a sport fishing vessel, there was no need to venture that far, expending unnecessary fuel to find fish. The mystery deepened when they noticed the boat's 23-meter anchor had been lowered. Even though the water was over 60 meters deep, the boat couldn't have drifted so close to Cuba on its own. This was perplexing, especially considering its original course. The route from Miami to Bimini crosses the Gulf Stream, which flows northward at a speed of 8–10 kilometers per hour. If the boat had encountered mechanical issues, the current would have quickly carried it north. For the Joe Cool to end up so far south near Cuba, someone would have had to deliberately steer it against the current. So someone had brought the boat to this location, and now no one on board was responding to the Coast Guard's calls to establish contact. In such a situation, one could imagine anything. Pirates might have been hiding in the cabin, for instance. Proceeding with great caution, the officers boarded the vessel, but the boat was, in fact, empty. However, something had clearly happened. The chaos that reigned everywhere and the presence of blood told its own story. Wallets, car keys, and other personal belongings were still there, indicating that the people on board had not intended to leave the boat in a hurry. Where were the 6 individuals who had been on the Joe Cool? Perhaps the missing lifeboat could hold the answer. The Coast Guard immediately began searching for the lifeboat. They worked against the clock as time was critical. Lifeboats are built to be sturdy, but the rescuers had no way of knowing the condition of the passengers and crew. Some or all of them could be injured, making every moment precious, especially as the weather began to deteriorate. Meanwhile, the Joe Cool was officially declared a crime scene. The Coast Guard called in the FBI, as crimes occurring on the high seas fall under their jurisdiction. 3 days had passed since Joe Cool left the port of Miami. On that day, a helicopter spent about an hour searching for the missing lifeboat when its crew spotted something orange floating in the water. It was the lifeboat. Its canopy was raised, but as the helicopter descended, the downdraft from its blades blew the canopy off. Inside the lifeboat, rescuers saw 2 people, out of the 6 who had gone missing. This was not a promising sign. The rescue team lowered a basket and brought the 2 individuals aboard the helicopter one by one. Due to the noise in the helicopter, communication with the survivors was conducted using a notebook and pen. The pilot handed them the notebook, asking what had happened and if they were okay. One of the men wrote, "West of Bimini, we were left in the boat, hijacking, 4 killed." The survivors were identified as the two passengers of Joe Cool, Guillermo Zaragoza and Kirby Archer. The men claimed that there was no one else left to rescue. They explained that 3 Cuban pirates had boarded the boat and killed all the crew members. After such a statement, the Coast Guard had no choice but to call off the search efforts. Meanwhile, officers continuing their work aboard the Joe Cool discovered 4 shell casings. This aligned with the fact that there were 4 victims. However, the crime scene was peculiar. It looked as though a hurricane had torn through the boat, yet nothing had been stolen. If pirates had attacked the vessel, it would make sense that they did so for money or valuables. But they hadn't stolen the boat itself, the $70,000 worth of fishing gear, the electronics, or the credit cards. Instead, they left behind odd items: an air gun, darts for it, handcuff keys, and even a shuriken. Objects considered weapons, which no one would reasonably bring on a pleasant fishing trip. This suggested the pirates had brought these items with them, but why would they leave them behind? Additionally, experienced seamen immediately noticed that whoever directed the boat against the current had done so ineptly, causing it to run out of fuel far too quickly. Pirates operating in the ocean wouldn't have made such a mistake. All these details raised serious doubts among the officers about the accuracy of the 2 survivors' story. The next step for investigators was to interrogate Guillermo and Kirby. If anyone had answers to their questions, it had to be these 2 men. Both recounted the same story. According to them, 3 Cuban pirates boarded the Joe Cool and immediately killed the captain. Next, they shot Kelly because she began to panic. The pirates then ordered the 2 other crew members, Sammy and Scott, to throw the bodies overboard. When they refused, the pirates killed them too. Guillermo claimed that the pirates then forced him to dispose of the bodies, a task he complied with in the hopes of being spared. He also said he tidied up the boat slightly under their orders. The pirates allegedly forced Kirby to take control of the vessel, abandoning their own boat as they set course southward for Cuba. The journey lasted about 8 hours until the fuel ran out. At some point, a 3rd speedboat appeared, and the pirates supposedly boarded it and sped away, leaving Guillermo and Kirby stranded in the middle of the ocean. The 2 survivors decided to move into the lifeboat, bringing their belongings, and attempted to make their way to shore. However, the neat story Guillermo and Kirby had crafted quickly unraveled when investigators began asking follow-up questions. For instance, when asked about the pirates' appearances and clothing, Guillermo described 2 young men and an older man who seemed to be the leader. According to him, the pirates wore polo shirts and jeans, but Kirby contradicted this, claiming the pirates were dressed in shirts and shorts. Their accounts also conflicted on the sequence of the killings. Guillermo stated that Jake was still alive when he was thrown overboard, while Kirby claimed that Kelly was the one still breathing at that time. The biggest inconsistency was their inability to explain why they abandoned a fully operational, well-equipped boat to climb into the lifeboat. The Joe Cool had all the necessary equipment to send a distress signal, which would have immediately brought help from the Coast Guard. By this point, investigators had a clear idea of who they should suspect, but they needed concrete evidence. Now the challenge was finding a way to keep the men in custody while building their case. First and foremost, investigators delved into the backgrounds of the 2 men, and they uncovered a lot of surprising information. Guillermo was just 18 years old. His family had moved to the United States from Cuba in 1999, and after winning the visa lottery, they settled in Florida. The young man still lived with his parents. He didn't drink, didn't use drugs, and had never had any issues with the law. Guillermo was known to be polite, social, and considerate. He worked as a security guard, but had always dreamed of becoming a police officer. In fact, Guillermo had applied to join the police force right before he and Kirby boarded the Joe Cool. Overall, everyone who knew Guillermo regarded him as a kind, generous, and thoughtful young man, and no one had a bad word to say about him. The past of 35-year-old Kirby Archer was far more eventful. His legal troubles began in 1993 when he was 22 years old. He had joined the Army after being accused of involvement in a crime involving a minor. The charge stemmed from the fact that his 15-year-old girlfriend hadn't returned home to her parents on time. In the Army, he worked for a long period as a military police investigator at the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba. However, in 2003, he went AWOL, absent without leave, and was subsequently discharged from the Army. Kirby boasted that he simply chose the easiest way to leave the military, which he had grown tired of. After his discharge, he settled in Arkansas with his second wife and 2 children, but the couple soon decided to divorce. The breakup was extremely scandalous, as his wife accused him of having an affair with his own niece and fathering her child. Kirby denied any sexual relationship with his niece, but he did not deny being listed as the father on the child's birth certificate. Shortly after the divorce, Kirby became the subject of an investigation for child molestation. It's unclear whether the investigation was connected to his niece or whether it involved other matters, but the charges were serious enough that he was banned from seeing his own children unsupervised. Despite this, he eventually found love again and remarried for a third time. In January 2007, about 9 months before boarding the Joe Cool, Kirby decided to test his luck. On January 26th, he went to work as usual. Kirby Archer worked as a customer service manager at a Walmart supermarket. At the end of his shift, he collected cash and checks, which was part of his duties. He then took the money, over $92,000, and the checks to a storage room. There, he took a new microwave out of its box, placed the money inside, and packed the microwave back into the box. After sealing it, he walked to the cashier, used his employee discount to purchase the microwave, and confidently walked out of the store. Kirby likely thought using his discount would make him look less suspicious, or perhaps he couldn't resist the chance to save a bit, even while stealing from his workplace. Either way, he knew the police would quickly catch up with him, so he fled. Kirby headed for sunny Miami. How did the young, law-abiding 18-year-old get involved with a 35-year-old criminal? Kirby met Guillermo in March or April of 2007. They had a mutual acquaintance, Carlos, who owned an auto repair shop. Guillermo had a strong interest in fast cars and enjoyed spending time around them. Meanwhile, Kirby had been telling Carlos that he worked for the CIA and had connections. Carlos, believing that someone with such connections could be useful to the young man, who was passionate about becoming a law enforcement officer, decided to introduce them. Investigators began to piece together why 4 people were killed. The police believed that Kirby, who was facing serious charges, had never intended to go to Bimini. From the start, he had planned to turn the boat toward Cuba. Cuba has no extradition treaty with the U.S., and since he had once served in the military on Cuba and spoke Spanish, it would have been relatively easy for him to disappear and blend into the local society. There were many aspects that supported the police's theory. First of all, the pirates' behavior was completely illogical. It wasn't just that they didn't take valuable items. It was the fact that pirates typically don't kill people on a ship they're hijacking. 1 or 2 people might get hurt, but pirates generally try to spare everyone's life because word of mouth spreads fast. Every sailor would soon know that encounters with pirates inevitably end in death, meaning that when pirates attacked the next ship, the victims would fight back to the last man. Additionally, the police searched both Guillermo's and Kirby's homes. While they didn't find any weapons on the boat, which the criminals likely threw overboard, they were able to link the men to the weapon used in the killings. Since Guillermo worked as a security guard, he had a permit to carry a weapon issued by Florida. At his home, they found a receipt for ammunition matching the caliber of the bullets used in the fatal shooting. The men were arrested. They were informed that the police had enough evidence to prove their guilt, and the prosecution would insist on the death penalty for them. Fearing the death sentence, Kirby Archer decided to confess. He explained that he had bought a gun, and Guillermo had taken his own gun. Initially, the plan was simply to hijack the vessel and drop off the crew somewhere on the way to Cuba. The accomplices thought they would be accompanied by 2 crew members and did not expect there to be 4. However, the plans did not change. During the trip, according to Kirby, Captain Jake Brenham behaved strangely, so Kirby told Guillermo to wait for a signal. But the young man didn't listen and shot Scott and Samuel. Then Kirby shot the captain and his wife. Afterward, the accomplices disposed of the bodies and guns and headed toward Cuba, but they ran out of fuel. They had no choice but to board the lifeboat and hope that the Cuban Coast Guard would find them and take them to Cuba. Once on the lifeboat, they made up a story about a pirate attack. Since Kirby Archer decided to confess, the only thing left was to determine his punishment. With Guillermo, things were not as clear. It was unclear whether he knew about the plan to kill the crew members or if he had become the 5th victim and an unwitting accomplice to Kirby. In prison, he shared his version of events with another inmate, and he repeated the same version in court in 2008 when he took the witness stand. According to his account, Kirby had initially told Captain Jake Brenham that he had changed his mind and wanted to go to Cuba. Jake, of course, refused, and a heated argument ensued. While Guillermo briefly went to the bathroom, shots were fired. When he ran to see what was happening, he saw Kirby holding his gun. That is, Kirby had rummaged through Guillermo's bag and taken his pistol. He shot all 4 members of the crew. Then Kirby pointed the gun at Guillermo and forced him to throw the bodies overboard and clean up. After that, he started the boat and headed south, but after several hours, they ran out of fuel. Guillermo wanted to stay on the boat with his luggage until help arrived, but Kirby threw the luggage into the lifeboat and told Guillermo to get into it too. There, he came up with the story about pirates that they would tell the rescuers. Guillermo agreed to stick to it because he was afraid of Kirby. In court, he did not dispute that he had brought a gun aboard, but not for murder. He thought it would be necessary for the security work they would be doing. Guillermo believed they were going to do private security work in Bimini, and then he would accompany Kirby to Cuba for a mission with the CIA. He believed until the end that Kirby worked for the CIA and did not know that he was being sought by the police. He hoped that if he helped Kirby complete this mission, Kirby would help him get into the CIA. He passed 2 polygraph tests, and according to the polygraph examiner, he had not planned the murders. However, the prosecution did not believe in Guillermo's innocence, and they had at least one piece of evidence that the defense could not explain. The Coast Guard studied the GPS data on the Joe Cool and found that halfway from Miami to Bimini, the boat suddenly stopped. The engine was inactive for exactly 1 minute and 18 seconds before it was started again and directed south toward Cuba. That is, if we are to believe Guillermo, in just over a minute, Kirby managed to kill 4 people and intimidate his accomplice into obeying him unquestioningly and throwing the bodies overboard. This was hard to believe. Additionally, Carlos, the owner of the auto repair shop, who had introduced Guillermo and Kirby, took the witness stand. He knew about the original plan of the defendants, which initially involved hijacking a local speedboat, reaching the Bahamas, refueling, and then heading to Cuba. However, they were unable to steal a suitable boat, and a few days before the trip, they bought weapons because, as Kirby had told Carlos, they switched to Plan B. The jury deliberated for 4 days. They decided that Guillermo was guilty of causing death with a firearm, but could not find him guilty of murder. The judge later explained that the jury might have made such a contradictory decision because they believed that Guillermo did not kill the people, but was guilty because his weapon was used. It was clear that the jury was confused. The judge had to annul the trial. The prosecution tried to retry Guillermo in 2009. Guillermo continued to maintain his innocence, convinced that his actions were part of an undercover CIA operation. The evidence in the second trial against him was exactly the same as in the first trial, except that the police found something interesting on the young man's computer. It turns out that he had told his friends he was planning a trip to Cuba for a CIA mission and warned them that they might see his name in the news as missing. However, he never mentioned the trip to Bimini. Additionally, he made many search queries with the word Cuba, but only searched for information about Bimini once. According to the prosecution, this indicated that the young man had known from the very beginning that they were heading to Cuba, not the Bahamas. In the second trial, the prosecution succeeded in securing a conviction against Guillermo. He was found guilty on 16 charges. Both men were sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Still, the prosecution could never explain why Guillermo got involved in this venture. If Kirby really had a reason to flee to Cuba and was willing to do anything for it, even murder, Guillermo had no such necessity. Did he agree to participate in the murder of 4 people just for the faint promise of a job in the CIA from someone he barely knew? In any case, the men had a plan to escape to Cuba, but they did not account for the amount of fuel needed for such a journey or the difficulties of navigating the boat against the Gulf Stream. Fortunately, their inexperience at sea allowed both of them to be sent to prison for the rest of their lives. 4 people lost their lives entirely unnecessarily. To this day, the bodies of the 4 crew members and the weapon used to kill them have not been found.